So let's continue this journey. I'm going to take some material from this book called Africa from MIS 6 to 2, Population Dynamics and Paleo-Environments. There is some modeling of population dynamics through these stages as a chapter in the book that I'll show in the next podcast. Let's just start by looking at the marine isotope stages again, going from 200,000 years to the present, basically into the Holocene, looking at benthic delta O18. As you remember, when it's more depleted, it is colder. So MIS 6 obviously colder, substantial warming into several stages of MIS 5, where we had stadial, interstadial, glacial, interglacial. Depending on the time scales, different names are used, but you can see there's a warming here, cooling, warming, cooling, warming. So the gray shades correspond to colder periods, and depending on which time series you look at, you will see more time scales, which again we looked at in terms of simulations. Okay, of course we had the middle Pleistocene and the middle Stone Age to late Stone Age here, and the transition happened during the late Pleistocene here, coming into the Holocene. And the book provides one chapter, second chapter, where a schematic is provided for representing the interaction between landscape, paleoclimate, resource availability including fauna, so animals, and human behavior. The primary purpose here is to summarize potential interactions identified in the review in this chapter, and not to provide a prescriptive framework. So the diagram highlights the role of inherited characteristics like geological features of the time in mediating local responses to global scale forces of landscape and climate change. So desertification, expansion of deserts, refugia, coastal resource visibility, availability, site selections, and so on. So this is interesting to go through. So geology can be a driver which changes macro scale topographic and coastal configurations, shelf areas, mountain building, and so on, and of course can also change substrate, nutrients, and vegetation dynamics. These topographical coastal configurations affect the humans and the fauna, driving migrations and movement through the landscape. When fauna migrate, ecosystems don't move. Specific species, which are more generalists, can follow changes in temperature, precipitation, humidity, etc., and maybe even slopes, but the so-called sedentary specialists may go extinct, changing local biodiversity and affecting humans, forcing migration or concentration into refugia, and so on and so forth. And the vegetation change here can affect total resources, just like migration and movement through landscapes seek out or change total resources, and they also change or seek out site availability, selection, and use. Obviously, vegetation change can also change fauna, so game, availability of animals to be hunted, and they are also affected by global, regional, and local expression of paleoclimatic changes with global drivers like orbital changes or mountain building, for example, which can also be associated with eustatic sea level change. Obviously, eustatic you may already have heard of. When you build glaciers, you take out water from the ocean and lock it up on land, build massive amounts of water. That changes global sea level, which we call eustatic. But when the glacier builds, the land under it is pushed down and the land ahead of it is pushed up. And when glacier melts, it comes back up and the land goes back down ahead of it. So these local changes are isostatic changes. And landscape form and respond to these sea level changes, which of course again affect site availabilities and selection and use based on total resources. And of course both of these things together can affect technology, expertise, behavior, social networking, communications, cooperation, sharing of technologies, and so on. as inferred from the different archaeological sites. Okay, so that's a good kind of framework in which we can think about human interactions. So coming back to then climate briefly, this one is reverse the shading, so warm periods are shaded and cold periods are gray. So again looking at delta 018 but going a little back further to 300 kilo years. We've talked about multiple stages of MIS 5, the cold MIS 6, and the glacial maximum that happened in MIS 2, for example, coming out into the Holocene by MIS 1, right? Just to revisit Africa in terms of movements, we looked at it in terms of genetics and potential mixing within or mixing with one particular group here and then migrating out and so on. But nonetheless, looking at various potential movements over different periods, 200 to 120 kilo years, various sites, 124 sorry, 148, 130 here, 179 and 142, and in the 120 to 70 kilo years, so these are the various stages we have already looked at. Again, various groups, archaeological sites dated to various times. Here 70 to 30 kilo years, you can see now out of Africa more actively, as we talked about before, and interactions with Neanderthals started elsewhere, and we don't know if Denisovans were present or not. And there were within Africa pathways that were different based on the periods and desertification, desert expansion, physical, geographical and climatological bottlenecks and so on. Okay, so this is more recent in the Holocene, 5 kilo years to the present, so there are more clusterings here in terms of the groups done in this way. The other big event that happened in this period is the 74,000 year supervolcanic eruption Toba, which has left marks everywhere, including humans at the time, precipitation, temperature, of course. So typically a modeling is done by using different loadings of emissions, 2000 teragrams of SO2 over some scale, 200 teragrams of SO2 at two different scales, and different times of the year to see how eruption at different times would have had different impacts on temperature and precipitation. We have evidence and timing of the volcanic eruption approximately, but we don't know the loading, or we know it was quite massive by its impact globally, but we don't know exactly what time of the year it erupted and exactly in which year. But nonetheless, looking at aerosol loading, various levels, and how dry deposition and wet deposition would have removed them a few years after the eruption, and how the cooling happens after the eruption rapidly and then dies away based on the loading, and also based on what time of the year the eruption would have happened. This also impacts precipitation changes. So this is the global mean precipitation. High loading, of course, would have created massive droughts that lasted multiple years and would have had huge impacts on flora, fauna and humans and behaviors and refugia and everything else. But you can see that precipitation impact would have been not so obvious, maybe except for increased variations in terms of global change when the loading is smaller based on what time of the year it erupted. These things matter because in modern times, we will see later on in the next chapter that volcanic eruptions could have played a role in the termination of the medieval warm period, extinction of occupation of Greenland by the Vikings, and initiation of the Little Ice Age and so on. So we know that volcanoes do create a global cooling and can create year without a summer like in 1816, and massive crop losses, droughts and so on, as happened in 1896 as well. This is a map showing the global distribution of temperature changes in a latitudinal sense for 200 teragrams of SO2, and then focusing in on Africa here. So the distribution of various hominin species is shown. Homo sapiens were all over. There is separate evidence that the hominins survived the eruption in India. Neanderthals were present here in small places, South Africa, Lake Malawi, and India locations. Denisovans, we don't know if they were around, but that remained interesting bit of evidence anyways. So if you zoom in onto Africa, you see more contrasts, much more cooling here than here. So this relates to how circulation would have spread the loading of volcanic ash and chemicals in the model. The Hadley cell versus Walker cell, the wiping out of the aerosols by the rainfall changes, and so on and so forth. So talking about the rainfall change, here it is. There is massive global drying, as you can see with the reddish colors. These are precipitation anomalies in meters over the period of simulation, as we saw before. So you can see that there were refugia or local spots of increased precipitation as rendered by the model, with minimal changes in some other places. This is the distribution of zonal mean precipitation in the present climate, and then the anomalies with respect to that. So if you zoom into Africa, you see there were massive dryings in the Namib Desert area into the wet regions of the West African monsoon, and then maybe wetting of the drier, currently dry region of Sahara and the Sub-Sahel. The striped regions are where the confidence in the results is low, so less than 90% in a statistical test. So obviously important, but just want you to keep in mind that local manifestations of a global driver like volcanic eruption become very important in inferring the impacts on the environment, landscape, resources, and on the hominins as well. Okay. Maybe I'll just include this as well here, just to complete this story. The depopulation history of Northeast Asia from late Pleistocene to the Holocene. Various estimates pre-last glacial maximum, before 33,000 before present. So you can see ancestral and derived populations. These were all ancestral. By 19,000 you had derived populations in East Asia, and after 14,000 BP you had lots of derived populations with some ancestral populations remaining. So these are the sites being looked at here. Widespread Tian Yuan ancestry in Northeast Asia, easily inferred from genetics and haplogroups that we talked about before. By 14,000 year genetic continuum in Amur region had a mix of various populations as well. So the highlights of this paper are that Tianwan AR33K ancestry was widespread in northern East Asia before the last glacial maximum, so that's before 21,000 years ago, so by 33,000 years BP by this evidence collected here. The earliest northern East Asian appeared in Amur region at the end of the LGM, so that's by 19,000 years here. The AR14K related population is the closest East Asian source for ancient Paleo-Siberians, so you can infer that as Denisovans, I suppose, but please check. And this site likely increased to high frequency after the last glacial maximum. Okay, so that is some other site here. Okay, so this is in brief says they demonstrate that the ancestry of circa 40 kilo year individual from Tianwan Cave near Beijing was widespread geographically and temporally before the last glacial maximum, so 26.5 to 19 kiloyears. At the end of the last glacial maximum, the earliest northern East Asian appeared after 14 kiloyear population in the Amur region comprised the closest East Asian source known for ancient Paleo-Siberians. Among adaptive genetic variants, these are the various likely to have been elevated to high frequency after LGM. So here it is EDAR V370A genetic component. Let's then come back and look at some of the impacts on hydrology and other aspects of climate during the MIS stages, just to continue the story before we get to specific environmental features that got altered by climate change during this MIS 6. There are general typologies which would happen during any cooling and warming periods, but we'll just look at what is relevant for hominin evolution and migrations. Okay.